What would you do if the man who promised to protect you pushed you out of his car into the rain, 8 months pregnant, and drove away to his mistress? That is exactly what happened to Elena Cross. But here is what her billionaire husband did not know. She was not just his wife. She was a forensic accountant who had been secretly documenting his crimes for 3 years. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every corrupt deal. And that night, bleeding on the pavement, watching his taillights disappear, she made a decision. She would not just survive, she would destroy him. Build tension. What follows is a story of betrayal so deep it will make your blood boil. Of a pregnant woman abandoned, hit by a car, and left for dead. Of a powerful man who thought he was untouchable. But fate has a way of remembering cruelty and revenge. Revenge is a dish best served by a woman with nothing left to lose. Value statement. This story will teach you 3 things. First, never underestimate someone you have broken. Second, patience is the most powerful weapon. And third, no matter how dark your night becomes, there is always a path back to the light. The marble hallway of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse stretched before Elena Cross like the throat of some great beast, ready to swallow her whole. She paused at the heavy oak doors, her hand resting instinctively on the slight curve of her belly beneath her tailored black dress. 9 months pregnant, 9 months of waiting, 3 years of planning, and it all came down to this moment. The doors swung open, and 200 faces turned toward her. Journalists clutching notebooks, lawyers shuffling papers, FBI agents in their standard-issue suits lining the walls, and there, at the defendant's table, sat the man who had once promised to love her until death. Marcus Hale. His eyes met hers across the courtroom, and for a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker behind that carefully constructed mask. Fear, perhaps. Or maybe just surprise that she was still standing after everything he had done to destroy her. Elena walked forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Each step brought memories flooding back. The night he left her bleeding in the street, the hospital room where she learned her evidence had been destroyed, the moment they took her daughter from her arms. But those memories no longer had power over her. She had transformed them into fuel, into purpose, into the weapon that would finally bring Marcus Hale to his knees. She took her place at the witness stand, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the jury. The prosecutor stepped forward. Mr. Reyes, a sharp-eyed man with silver threading through his dark hair. He had been working this case for 2 years, but Elena had been working it longer. Please state your name for the record. Elena Cross, formerly Elena Hale. And your relationship to the defendant? Elena glanced at Marcus. He sat perfectly still, his expensive suit impeccable, his expression carefully neutral. The same expression he wore when he pushed her out of his car onto a rain-slicked street. He is my ex-husband, she said, and the father of my child. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The journalists scribbled furiously. Marcus's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Cross, the prosecutor continued, can you tell the court when you first discovered the defendant's criminal activities? Elena took a breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when the truth would finally come to light. I discovered it on our wedding night, she said, 3 years ago. The murmur became a wave. Even the judge leaned forward. And what did you do with that knowledge? Elena's lips curved into the faintest smile. Not a smile of joy, but of grim satisfaction. The smile of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged holding the matches. I did what any good forensic accountant would do, she said. I started building a case. The courtroom erupted. Marcus shot to his feet, his lawyer grabbing his arm. Cameras flashed despite the judge's orders, and Elena sat perfectly still in the chaos, her hand resting on her belly, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. It had started with love, or what she thought was love. It had continued with betrayal, with violence, with a pregnant wife left bleeding in the street while her husband drove away to his mistress. But it would end with justice, because Elena Cross had learned something important in the 3 years since Marcus Hale destroyed her life. She had learned that the best revenge is not a moment of fury. It is not a dramatic confrontation or a public humiliation. The best revenge is patience, planning, and the absolute certainty that when you finally strike, your enemy will never see it coming. Let me take you back to the beginning. To the woman Elena was before Marcus Hale entered her life and shattered everything she believed about love, about trust, and about her own strength. 3 years earlier, Elena Cross was a rising star at Goldman Sachs. At 32, she had already made a name for herself in the forensic accounting division, the department that specialized in finding fraud hidden in the complex webs of corporate finance. Her colleagues called her the Bloodhound because once she caught a scent, she never let go. She had grown up in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, the daughter of a construction foreman and a nurse. Her parents had taught her the value of hard work, of integrity, of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Those lessons had served her well in the cutthroat world of Wall Street, where everyone seemed to have an angle, and nothing was ever quite what it appeared. Elena loved her job. She loved the puzzle of it, the way numbers told stories that people tried desperately to hide. She loved the moment when everything clicked into place, when the truth emerged from the chaos of spreadsheets and transactions like a photograph developing in a darkroom. But she had never worked on a case quite like Hale Enterprises. The assignment came on a Tuesday morning in March. Her supervisor, a graying man named Patterson, who had been with the firm for 30 years, called her into his office and closed the door. "I need you to handle something delicate," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "Hale Enterprises. They are applying for a major line of credit, and we need to verify their financials." Elena opened the folder and scanned the first page. Hale Enterprises was a real estate development company worth several $billions, with properties across Manhattan, Los Angeles, and Miami. At its helm sat Marcus Hale, a self-made billionaire who had risen from modest beginnings to become one of the most powerful men in New York. "What is the concern?" she asked. Patterson hesitated. "Probably nothing, but there have been whispers, irregularities in their cash flow, properties that seem to appreciate faster than the market justifies. Just take a look and make sure everything is clean." He paused, and something in his expression made Elena's instincts prickle. "But Elena," he added, lowering his voice, "be careful. Marcus Hale is connected. Politicians, judges, federal agencies. He has friends everywhere. If you find something, bring it to me before you do anything else. Understood?" Elena nodded, but inside, her curiosity was already burning. In her experience, when powerful people warned you to be careful, it usually meant there was something worth finding. She had no idea how right she was. For the next 2 weeks, Elena buried herself in the financials of Hale Enterprises. She worked late into the night, surrounded by stacks of documents and the glow of multiple computer screens. She traced transactions through shell companies in the Caymans. She cross-referenced property valuations with market data. She built spreadsheets that mapped the flow of money through Marcus Hale's empire, like blood through a circulatory system, and what she found made her blood run cold. The irregularities Patterson had mentioned were just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, Elena discovered a sophisticated network of fraud, properties purchased with laundered money, Fake investors whose contributions disappeared into offshore accounts. A Ponzi scheme so elegantly constructed that it had been operating undetected for at least a decade. Marcus Hale was not just a billionaire, he was a criminal mastermind who had built his empire on lies. Elena documented everything. She copied files. She created encrypted backups. She prepared a report that would blow the case wide open. And then Marcus Hale walked into her life. She was working late on a Thursday evening when the door to her office opened without a knock. Elena looked up, ready to snap at whoever had interrupted her concentration, and found herself face to face with the most compelling man she had ever seen. Marcus Hale was tall, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and eyes the color of a winter's sky. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. "You must be Elena Cross," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, the famous bloodhound. Elena felt her heart rate spike, but she kept her expression neutral. "Can I help you?" "I hope so." He smiled, and something about that smile made her feel like she was standing in a spotlight. "I understand you have been looking into my company." Alarm bells screamed in Elena's head. How did he know? Who had told him? Her report was not even finished yet. "That is standard procedure for a credit application," she said carefully. "Of course." Marcus stepped closer, and she caught a hint of expensive cologne. "I just wanted to introduce myself, to offer my full cooperation with your investigation." He tilted his head, studying her with unsettling intensity, "and perhaps to take you to dinner." Elena blinked. "Excuse me?" "Dinner. Tomorrow night. There is a new French restaurant in Tribeca that I have been wanting to try, and I hate eating alone." "Mirhale, I am auditing your company. It would be completely inappropriate for me to—" "Marcus," he interrupted. "Please, call me Marcus, and I am not asking you as an auditor. I am asking you as a man who finds intelligent women irresistibly attractive." He held out a card, heavy cream paper with embossed lettering, just his name and a phone number. "Think about it," he said. "I promise I am much more interesting than spreadsheets." And then he was gone, leaving Elena standing in her office with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She should have reported him immediately. She should have told Patterson that Marcus Hale was attempting to compromise the investigation. She should have listened to every instinct that screamed this was a trap. But Elena had never been good at walking away from puzzles, and Marcus Hale was the most fascinating puzzle she had ever encountered. She did not call him that night, or the next day. She threw herself back into her investigation, determined to finish her report and expose Marcus Hale for the fraud he was. But the flowers started arriving. First, a simple bouquet of white roses on her desk, then an extravagant arrangement of orchids that took up half her office, then 500 red roses delivered by a fleet of couriers who lined the hallway outside her door. Her best friend Charlie, a nurse at Mount Sinai who had been her roommate in college, stopped by to drop off lunch and stared at the floral explosion in disbelief. "Either someone really loves you," Charlie said, picking up a card, "or you are being stalked by a very romantic serial killer." "It is neither," Elena muttered, though her cheeks flushed. "It is just a business contact." "A business contact who sends 500 roses?" Charlie raised an eyebrow. "Elena, what is going on?" Elena told her everything: the investigation, the fraud she had discovered, Marcus Hale's unexpected appearance, and his dinner invitation. Charlie listened with growing concern. "This sounds like a trap. He is trying to compromise you so you will not report what you found." I know, Elena said. I am not stupid. Then why are you smiling like that? Elena realized she was, in fact, smiling. She forced her expression into something more serious. I am not smiling. You are absolutely smiling. Oh my God. Charlie grabbed her shoulders. Elena Maria Cross, do not tell me you are actually considering going out with this man. Of course not, Elena said quickly. That would be insane. But that night, lying in her small apartment in Brooklyn, staring at the ceiling, Elena could not stop thinking about Marcus Hale, about the way he looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room, about the confidence in his voice when he said he found intelligent women irresistibly attractive. She knew it was manipulation. She knew he was dangerous. She knew that falling for him would be the worst mistake of her life. But Elena had always been drawn to danger, to puzzles, to the thrill of uncovering hidden truths. What if, she thought, I could get close to him? What if I could find evidence that even my current investigation has not uncovered? It was a rationalization, and she knew it. But it was enough. The next morning, she called the number on Marcus Hale's card. Their first date was at a restaurant where the cheapest bottle of wine cost more than Elena's weekly grocery budget. Marcus was charming, attentive, and genuinely interested in her work. He asked intelligent questions about forensic accounting. He told stories about his own rise from poverty to billions that made her laugh and occasionally made her eyes sting with unexpected emotion. By the end of the evening, Elena had almost forgotten that this man was a criminal, that she had documented proof of his fraud, that she was supposed to be investigating him, not falling for him. Almost. She let him kiss her goodnight, but refused his invitation to come upstairs to his penthouse. She went home to her Brooklyn apartment and sat on her bed, her heart racing, her mind churning. She should end this now. Submit her report. Watch Marcus Hale's empire crumble. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he talked about his childhood, about growing up with nothing and clawing his way to the top. Maybe it was the vulnerability she glimpsed behind his confident facade. Maybe it was simply that she had never felt this alive in her entire life. She told herself she was playing a long game, gathering intelligence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She almost believed it. 6 months later, Elena Cross became Elena Hale. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the penthouse that would become her new home. Charlie was her maid of honor, her expression tight with worry throughout the ceremony. Her parents attended, but seemed overwhelmed by the wealth surrounding them. Her father shook Marcus's hand with the firm grip of a man who was not easily impressed. You take care of my daughter, he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. I will, Marcus promised. She is the best thing that has ever happened to me. And for a moment, looking into his eyes, Elena believed him. That night, after the guests had gone and the champagne had been drunk, Elena excused herself to the bathroom. Her head was spinning, partly from alcohol and partly from the surreal reality of her new life. She splashed water on her face, took a deep breath, and noticed Marcus's jacket hanging on the door. She was not sure what had made her check the pocket. Instinct, perhaps. The bloodhound's nose for hidden truths. Inside, she found a phone. Not the phone Marcus usually carried, but a second one with a plain black case. Her heart pounding, she unlocked it and read the most recent messages, and her world collapsed. The texts were between Marcus and someone named Only V. They discussed Elena in clinical terms. The audit, her investigation, the need to neutralize the threat she posed. She is falling for it, one message read, just like we planned. By the time she realizes what happened, it will be too late. Elena's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. The room seemed to tilt around her. Every moment of the past 6 months replayed in her mind with sickening clarity. The flowers, the romantic dinners, the vulnerability that had seemed so genuine. All of it was a lie. All of it was a manipulation designed to compromise her investigation and silence her forever. Marcus Hale had not fallen in love with her. He had targeted her, hunted her, and she had walked willingly into his trap. She stood in that bathroom for a long time, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The white dress, the diamond ring, the face of a woman who had just discovered her entire life was a carefully constructed illusion. She could confront him, she could run, she could go to the police with what she had found. But Elena Cross was not a woman who ran, and she was not a woman who acted impulsively. She was the bloodhound, and the bloodhound never let go. Slowly, carefully, she put the phone back in Marcus's pocket. She fixed her makeup. She walked back into the bedroom where her husband was waiting with champagne and a smile that now looked like a wolf baring its teeth. "There you are," he said. "I was starting to think you had run away." Elena smiled back, a smile that hid the fire now burning in her chest. "Never," she said. "I am exactly where I want to be." And in that moment, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She would not run. She would not confront. She would not tip her hand. She would stay. She would watch. She would gather evidence. And when the time was right, she would destroy Marcus Hale completely. For the next 3 years, Elena played the role of the perfect wife while secretly building the case that would bring her husband to justice. It was exhausting work. Every day, she woke up next to a man she now despised and forced herself to smile, to kiss him, to pretend that nothing had changed. Every night, after Marcus fell asleep, she crept to her hidden laptop and documented his crimes. She copied files from his home office. She recorded conversations using a device disguised as a brooch. She mapped his network of shell companies and corrupt officials with the precision of a surgeon. She rented a storage unit in Jersey City under a false name. Inside, she built what she called her war room, walls covered with photographs and documents, timelines of transactions. A whiteboard mapping the connections between Marcus, his investors, and the politicians who protected him. Sometimes, alone in that storage unit at 2 a.m, Elena wondered if she was losing her mind. Playing a role for so long had started to blur the lines between who she really was and who she pretended to be. There were moments when Marcus looked at her with something like genuine affection, and she felt her heart twist with an emotion she refused to name. But then she would remember the texts, the cold calculation behind every romantic gesture, the knowledge that if Marcus ever discovered what she was doing, he would destroy her without hesitation. That knowledge kept her focused, kept her sharp, kept her playing the long game, even when every instinct screamed at her to run. The pregnancy was not part of the plan. Elena discovered she was expecting on a gray morning in November, 2.5 years into her secret investigation. She sat on the bathroom floor of their penthouse, staring at the positive test, her mind racing through implications. A child. Marcus's child. For a moment, she considered ending it. The timing was terrible. Bringing a baby into this situation would only complicate everything. But as the days passed, Elena found herself unable to go through with that option. Maybe it was hormones. Maybe it was the memory of her own childhood, of the love her parents had given her despite having nothing. Maybe it was simply that this child was the only genuine thing to emerge from the wreckage of her marriage. She told Marcus on Christmas Eve. His reaction surprised her. His face softened in a way she had never seen before. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Elena, this is the best gift you could have given me. For a terrifying moment, she almost believed him, almost let herself imagine that maybe, somehow, they could make this work. Maybe the man holding her was not the monster she had discovered. Maybe the tenderness in his voice was real, but that night she checked his burner phone again and found new messages. The timing is perfect, Marcus had written to V. A pregnant wife will make me look sympathetic. The press will love it. And if she ever tries to talk, who would believe a hormonal pregnant woman over me? Elena deleted her fingerprints from the phone and returned it to his jacket. She lay down beside her husband and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The child growing inside her had changed nothing. Marcus was still a predator, and she was still his prey. But now, she had a new reason to fight, a reason more powerful than justice or revenge. She was going to be a mother, and she would burn the world to the ground before she let Marcus Hale destroy her child. The months that followed were the hardest of Elena's life. Her body changed in ways she could not control. Morning sickness left her weak and vulnerable. The pregnancy brain everyone talked about made it harder to maintain her careful facade. But she kept working, kept documenting, kept building her case. She also reached out, for the first time, to someone who might be able to help. Gabriel Torres was her mother's godfather, a man Elena had known her entire life. He had been a forensic accountant for the FBI before retiring, and he had spent decades tracking white-collar criminals. More importantly, he had been investigating Marcus Hale's mentor for 20 years. Elena met him at a diner in Queens, choosing a location far from anywhere Marcus's people might spot them. Gabriel was in his late 50s now, his hair gone gray, his face lined with the weariness of a man who had seen too much corruption and too little justice. "I know what Marcus Hale is," she told him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have been documenting his crimes for almost 3 years, but I need help. I cannot do this alone." Gabriel listened, without interrupting, as she laid out everything she had discovered: the Ponzi scheme, the money laundering, the network of corrupt politicians and judges who protected Marcus's empire. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Do you understand what you are asking?" he finally said. "Marcus Hale has destroyed everyone who has ever tried to bring him down. Journalists, prosecutors, federal agents. They all ended up discredited, ruined, or dead." "I know. And you still want to fight him?" Elena placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "I do not have a choice. If I do nothing, he will own me forever, and he will own my child. I would rather die than let that happen." Gabriel studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "Your mother was my best friend," he said. "She made me promise to look after you if anything ever happened to her. I have not done a very good job of that promise." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Let me make it right. Let me help you bring this bastard down." For the first time in 3 years, Elena felt something like hope. But hope, she would learn, was a dangerous thing. 3 months later, 8 months pregnant and finally ready to move against Marcus, everything fell apart. It started with a conversation. Elena made the mistake of hinting to Marcus that she knew about his business problems. She thought she was being subtle, testing the waters before making her final move. She was wrong. Marcus's expression changed in an instant. The warmth drained from his eyes, replaced by something cold and calculating. Something that reminded her of a snake preparing to strike. "Who have you been talking to?" he demanded. "No one," Elena said quickly. "I just meant, do not lie to me." His voice was quiet, which somehow made it more terrifying. "I know you have been hiding something. I know you have been sneaking around. Did you think I would not notice? Elena's heart pounded. 3 years of careful planning, and she had given herself away with a single careless comment. Marcus, please. I am 8 months pregnant. You're scaring me. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Hesitation, perhaps, or maybe just calculation. Then he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. Get in the car, he said. We need to talk. The rain was coming down hard as they drove through Manhattan. Elena sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's Mercedes, her hands clasped over her belly, her mind racing through options. She could jump out at the next red light. She could scream for help. She could... I know about the storage unit, Marcus said quietly. Elena's blood turned to ice. I know about the laptop, the documents, the recordings. He glanced at her, his expression almost pitying. Did you really think you could hide from me? I have people everywhere, Elena. I have known about your little investigation for months. Then why did I let you continue? He laughed, a cold sound that made her skin crawl. Because I wanted to see how far you would go. Because it amused me to watch you play detective while I held all the cards. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. But playtime is over. Tonight, my people are cleaning out your storage unit. Tomorrow, my lawyers will begin the process of having you committed. Committed? Elena's voice came out as a whisper. Psychiatric evaluation. A pregnant woman suffering from delusions and paranoia. It happens all the time. He smiled. By the time our baby is born, you will be locked in a very comfortable facility, and I will have full custody. You will never see our child again. Panic clawed at Elena's throat. Marcus, please. I am your wife. I am carrying your baby. You are a liability, he said flatly, and I do not tolerate liabilities. He pulled the car to the side of the road. Rain hammered against the windows. They were somewhere in the East Village, on a street she did not recognize. Get out, Marcus said. What? Get out of the car, Elena. Marcus, it is raining. I am 8 months pregnant. Then you had better find shelter quickly. He reached across her and shoved open the passenger door. Cold rain immediately soaked her dress, her hair, her face. Please, she begged, do not do this. The baby will be fine. You, on the other hand, are on your own. And then he pushed her. Not hard, but hard enough. She stumbled out of the car and fell to her knees on the wet pavement. By the time she looked up, the Mercedes was already pulling away, its taillights disappearing into the rain. Elena knelt there in the street, 8 months pregnant, soaked to the bone, watching her husband abandon her. And then she heard it. The screech of tires, the blare of a horn. She turned and saw headlights racing toward her. There was no time to move, no time to scream. She raised her arms instinctively, as if she could shield her unborn child from the impact. And then the world exploded into pain and darkness. Elena woke to the sound of beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic. Her body felt like it had been through a car crusher, which, in a sense, it had. She tried to sit up and gasped at the pain that shot through her ribs, her leg, her spine. A nurse rushed in, gently pushing her back down. Easy, Mrs. Hale. You have been through a lot. You need to rest. My baby, Elena croaked. Is my baby? Your baby is fine, the nurse assured her. Strong heartbeat. No signs of distress. You protected her well. Her. Elena felt tears streaming down her face. She was having a daughter. But the relief was short-lived. As the nurse explained the extent of her injuries, Elena felt her hope crumbling piece by piece. 3 broken ribs, a fractured leg, damage to her spine that might be permanent. She would need months of physical therapy, and even then, she might never walk normally again. The driver who hit her had fled the scene. No witnesses, no license plate. Just another hit and run in a city full of them. Except Elena knew better. This was not an accident. This was Marcus, tying up loose ends. Detective Rosa Mendez arrived the next morning. She was a compact woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded Elena of her own mother. She introduced herself as a homicide detective who had been assigned to investigate the hit and run. Homicide? Elena asked. I did not die. No, but someone wanted you to. Mendez pulled up a chair beside the hospital bed. I have been doing this job for 20 years, Mrs. Hale. I know what a targeted attack looks like, and this has all the hallmarks. Hope flickered in Elena's chest. You believe me? I believe the evidence. Mendez flipped open a notebook. Your husband dropped you off in a rainstorm, 8 months pregnant, in the middle of nowhere. 5 minutes later, you get hit by a car that conveniently had no plates. Either that is the worst coincidence in history, or someone wanted you dead. She leaned forward. Tell me about your husband, Mrs. Hale. For a moment, Elena considered telling her everything. The investigation, the evidence, the storage unit that Marcus had probably already emptied. But something stopped her. If Marcus truly had people everywhere, if judges and federal agents were in his pocket, then going to the police might only make things worse. I do not know anything, she said finally. Marcus and I had an argument. He told me to get out of the car. I did. That is all I remember. Mendez studied her for a long moment. Mrs. Hale, I have seen women protect abusers before. It never ends well. I am not protecting anyone. Then why do I get the feeling you are not telling me the whole truth? Elena looked away. Because the truth would not make any difference. My husband has more power than you can imagine. Going against him would only get us both killed. She expected Mendez to argue. Instead, the detective nodded slowly. I understand, she said. But if you change your mind, here is my card. Day or night, you call me. She placed the card on the nightstand and walked out. Elena stared at the ceiling, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The next few weeks were a blur of pain and despair. Elena was transferred to a rehabilitation facility to begin physical therapy. The work was excruciating. Learning to walk again, to balance on legs that no longer seemed to belong to her. Some days, she made progress. Other days, she collapsed in frustration and tears. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation. Gabriel visited when he could, but the news was always bad. The storage unit had been emptied, just as Marcus promised. Her laptop, her documents, her recordings, 3 years of painstaking work, all gone. I am so sorry, Gabriel said, his voice heavy with guilt. I should have made backup copies. I should have... It is not your fault, Elena said dully. Marcus is just smarter than we thought. There has to be something we can do, some evidence we overlooked. But Elena was too exhausted to hope anymore. Marcus had won. He had taken everything from her, her evidence, her health, her future. And soon, he would take her daughter too. Chimam. The custody papers arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, watching rain streak down the glass, when a lawyer appeared with a stack of documents. Marcus was filing for divorce and full custody of their unborn child. He claimed Elena was mentally unstable, a danger to herself and others. He had psychiatric evaluations, witness statements, and a judge who was ready to sign whatever he put in front of him. The baby was due in 6 weeks. When Elena gave birth, Marcus's people would be waiting. They would take her daughter and give her to the man who had tried to have Elena killed. and there was nothing she could do to stop it. That night, alone in her room, Elena reached her lowest point. She thought about the window, about the medications in the nurse's station, about how easy it would be to simply stop fighting. She had lost everything, her evidence, her mobility, her freedom. What was the point of continuing to struggle? But then she felt it. A kick, strong and insistent, from the baby growing inside her, and then another, and another. Elena pressed her hand to her belly, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter was fighting. Even now, even with everything stacked against them, this tiny life was refusing to give up. How could Elena do any less? She wiped her eyes and reached for her phone. She had one card left to play, one desperate, impossible hope. She dialed Gabriel's number. "I need you to come see me," she said. "There is something I have not told you, something that might change everything." Gabriel arrived at the rehabilitation facility the next morning, his face tight with concern. Elena had never heard such urgency in her voice before, and he feared the worst. But what Elena told him was not a confession of defeat. It was a revelation that would reshape everything. "I made copies," she said. Gabriel stared at her. "What?" "Before Marcus found out about the storage unit. Before he knew I was investigating him." Elena's eyes gleamed with something that had been missing for weeks. Purpose. "I made copies of everything. My laptop, my documents, my recordings. I gave them to someone Marcus would never think to look for." "Who?" "His mother." Gabriel's jaw dropped. "Diane Hale? The woman is Marcus's biggest protector." "No." Elena shook her head slowly. "Diane Hale is Marcus's biggest regret. She knows exactly what her son is. She has always known, and she has been keeping records of his crimes since before I ever met him." She explained everything. How she had approached Diane secretly, 6 months into her investigation. How she had expected to be rejected, reported, destroyed. Instead, she found an unexpected ally. Diane Hale was old Boston money, raised in a world of propriety and reputation. When her son began showing signs of sociopathy as a child, she tried everything to fix him. Therapy, medication, tough love. Nothing worked. Marcus was simply broken in ways that could not be repaired. But Diane loved him anyway. She protected him, covered for him, used her connections to make his problems disappear, until she realized that her protection was only making him worse, more dangerous, more cruel. By then it was too late to stop him, but it was not too late to prepare for the day when he went too far. "She has been keeping evidence for 20 years, Elena said. Safe deposit boxes, offshore servers, documents hidden in places as Marcus does not even know exist. She was waiting for someone with the courage to use it. And you are that person? I was supposed to be." Elena's voice wavered. "But then Marcus found out about me. He destroyed my evidence. He left me broken in the street, and now he is going to take my daughter." She grabbed Gabriel's hand. "I need you to contact Diane. Tell her what happened. Tell her I need her help." Gabriel hesitated. "Elena, this is dangerous. If Diane turns on us—" "She will not. She has been waiting for this moment her entire life." Elena's grip tightened. "Please, Gabriel, this is my only chance." Gabriel looked at the desperate determination in her eyes. He thought about the promise he had made to her mother years ago, to protect Elena no matter what. "All right," he said finally. "I will reach out to Diane. But if this goes wrong—" "It will not," Elena said. "It cannot. Because if it does, Marcus wins, and I refuse to let that happen." Toast. The meeting with Diane Hale took place 3 days later, in a private room at the rehabilitation facility. Gabriel stood watch outside, while Elena faced the elegant, 70-year-old woman who might be her last hope. Diane looked nothing like Elena expected. She had imagined someone cold, aristocratic, distant. Instead, she found a woman whose eyes held decades of sorrow and guilt. "I saw the news," Diane said quietly. "What my son did to you, leaving you in the street like garbage." She closed her eyes. "I thought I had seen the worst of him. I was wrong. Mrs. Hale." "Diane, please." She opened her eyes. "You came to me 6 months ago with evidence of my son's crimes. I gave you copies of my own. I thought together we could bring him down." Her voice cracked. "Instead, I failed you. I failed to protect you when you needed it most." "You did not fail me," Elena said. "Marcus is clever. He would have found out eventually, no matter what we did." "Perhaps." Diane straightened in her chair. "But now he has made a mistake. He has overplayed his hand, and I intend to make him pay." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick envelope. "Everything is here," she said. "Financial records, witness statements, recordings of conversation my son thought were private, enough to destroy his empire 10 times over." Elena took the envelope with trembling hands. "Why? Why would you betray your own son?" Diane's expression hardened. "Because he is about to steal your daughter, and I will not allow him to destroy another generation of this family." She leaned forward. "I have spent 50 years cleaning up Marcus's messes, protecting him from the consequences of his actions, and all it has done is make him worse." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "When I am gone, there will be no one left to stop him, unless we stop him now." Elena nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "Survive," Diane said simply. "Have your baby. Get strong. And when the time is right, we will take him down together." She stood and walked to the door. Then she paused and looked back. "My son does not love you, Elena. He is not capable of love. But I want you to know something." Her eyes glistened. "If I could have chosen a daughter-in-law, I would have chosen someone exactly like you, strong, brave, willing to fight for what matters." And then she was gone, leaving Elena alone with an envelope full of evidence and a spark of hope that refused to die. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of preparation and concealment. Elena continued her physical therapy, pushing herself harder than the doctors recommended. She needed to walk again. She needed to be strong for what was coming. Gabriel coordinated with Diane, copying documents, building redundant backups, ensuring that this time Marcus would not be able to destroy their evidence. They also reached out to Agent Reyes at the FBI, who had been building his own case against Marcus for years, but lacked the insider access that Elin could provide. Everything was falling into place. They would wait until the baby was born, until Elena was strong enough to testify. Then they would strike. But Marcus, as always, was one step ahead. Elena went into labor 3 weeks early. She was in her room at the rehabilitation facility when her water broke. The next few hours were a blur of pain and fear and fluorescent lights as she was rushed to the hospital. She barely registered the faces around her, the voices giving orders, the monitors beeping warnings. All she could think about was her daughter, who was coming too early, too fast, before Elena was ready to protect her. The labor lasted 16 hours. Elena gripped Charlie's hand so hard she left bruises. She screamed until her throat was raw. She pushed until she had nothing left. And then finally she heard it. A tiny, furious cry. "It is a girl," the doctor announced. "A beautiful, healthy girl." They placed the baby in Elena's arms, and for one perfect moment the world stopped. Her daughter was perfect. Tiny fingers, tiny toes, a face scrunched up with indignation at being forced into this cold, bright world. "Grace," Elena whispered. "Her name is Grace." She had exactly 4 minutes with her daughter. Then the door opened, and Marcus's lawyers walked in. They had a court order. A judge had granted Marcus emergency custody, citing concerns about Elena's mental health and physical condition. Security guards flanked the lawyers, their expressions apologetic but firm. "Mrs. Hale, we need to take the child." "No!" Elena clutched Grace tighter. "No, you cannot. She is mine. She needs me. Ma'am, please, do not make this difficult." But Elena was beyond reason. She screamed. She fought. She would have killed them all with her bare hands if she could. It took 4 people to restrain her. Charlie was shouting, nurses were crying, and through it all, Elena watched helplessly as they took Grace from her arms and carried her out the door. The last thing she saw was her daughter's face, confused and crying, disappearing down the hallway. And then Elena was alone. The next 6 weeks were the darkest of Elena's life. She was released from the hospital, but forbidden from seeing her daughter. Marcus had moved Grace to an undisclosed location, with round-the-clock nannies and security. Elena's lawyers filed motion after motion, but every judge in the city seemed to be in Marcus's pocket. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything except the empty ache in her chest where her daughter should have been. Gabriel and Charlie took turns watching her, terrified she would hurt herself. They found her standing at windows, staring at traffic. They found pills she had hidden in her sock drawer. They found notes she had written and crossed out, goodbye letters to people she loved. But something always stopped her, the memory of Grace's tiny fingers wrapped around her own, the promise she had made to keep fighting no matter what. And slowly, painfully, Elena began to climb out of the pit. It started with anger. Anger at Marcus for everything he had taken. Anger at herself for ever falling for his lies. Anger at a system that protected predators and punished their victims. That anger became fuel. That fuel became determination. She would get her daughter back. She would destroy Marcus Hale. And she would do it in a way that left no doubt about who had won. Now, the plan came together over the next month. Diane provided the evidence. Gabriel coordinated with the FBI. Agent Reyes assembled a task force that included federal prosecutors, forensic accountants, and a judge who was not on Marcus's payroll. But they needed one more thing. They needed Elena to get close to Marcus again, to get him to incriminate himself on recording, to provide the final piece of evidence that would bring his empire crashing down. It was the most dangerous part of the plan. If Marcus suspected anything, he would kill her. This time, he would not fail. But Elena was done being afraid. She reached out to Marcus through his lawyers, claiming she wanted to negotiate. To her surprise, he agreed to meet. They met at his penthouse, the same penthouse where they had once lived as husband and wife. Elena walked through the marble foyer, past the crystal chandeliers, into the living room where Marcus was waiting with a glass of whiskey. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome, confident, completely convinced of his own invincibility. "Elena," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I have to admit, I did not expect to hear from you." "I want to see my daughter," she said flatly. "Our daughter is fine. Better than fine. She is being raised in luxury, with the best of everything. She is being raised by strangers. She needs her mother." Marcus laughed. "You? The woman who tried to destroy me? The woman who had a mental breakdown and was hit by a car in the middle of the street?" He shook his head. "Grace does not need you, Elena. She needs stability, security, things you cannot provide." Elena felt the old rage rising, but forced it down. She needed to play this carefully. "I know I made mistakes," she said, keeping her voice humble. "I was confused, paranoid, the pregnancy hormones, the stress of your work." She looked down at her hands. "I just want a chance to make things right." Marcus studied her for a long moment. She could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Was she genuinely broken? Was this a trick? Could he use her submission to his advantage? Finally, he nodded. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement, he said. Supervised visits, under my terms. Anything, Elena said. I will do anything. Over the next few weeks, Elena played the role of the repentant ex-wife. She visited Grace, under Marcus's watchful eye, holding her daughter and treasuring every precious moment while secretly gathering evidence. She wore a wire to every meeting. She recorded Marcus discussing his offshore accounts, his bribes to officials, his plans to expand his Ponzi scheme. She documented everything with the careful precision of the forensic accountant she had always been. And when she had enough, she set the final trap. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glittered like a jewel box on the night of the Skyline Gala. 500 of New York's elite had gathered to celebrate Marcus Hale's latest triumph, a billion-dollar real estate development that would reshape the city's skyline. Politicians mingled with celebrities. Champagne flowed like water. And at the center of it all stood Marcus, resplendent in his custom tuxedo, accepting congratulations as if he were a king receiving tribute. He had no idea that his kingdom was about to fall. Elena arrived at precisely 9 o'clock. She wore a midnight blue gown that flowed elegantly over her figure, diamonds glittering at her throat. The crowd parted as she walked through the grand hall, whispers following in her wake. Marcus saw her first. His expression flickered through surprise, confusion, and finally cold calculation. Elena, he said smoothly, meeting her at the center of the room, this is unexpected. I do not recall seeing your name on the guest list. Your mother invited me, Elena said. Marcus's eyes narrowed. My mother. Yes. Diane Hale stepped forward from the crowd, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. I thought it was time for a family reunion. The tension in the room was electric. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. Cameras, sensing drama, began to flash. Whatever you are planning, Marcus said quietly, it will not work. I have more power in this room than you can imagine. Do you? Elena smiled. Let us test that theory. She turned to the crowd and raised her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but there is something you all need to know about the man you are here to celebrate. Marcus grabbed her arm. Elena, stop this. 3 years ago, I discovered that Marcus Hale built his empire on fraud, money laundering, securities violations, a Ponzi scheme that has stolen billions from innocent investors. She pulled her arm free. I have evidence. Documents, recordings, witness statements, and tonight, you will all see the truth. The room erupted. Guests shouted questions. Marcus's lawyers pushed through the crowd, their faces panicked. And through the chaos, Elena stood calm and unshakable. You are insane, Marcus hissed. No one will believe you. They do not have to believe me, Elena said. They just have to believe the FBI. On cue, the doors of the gala opened, and Agent Reyes walked in, flanked by a dozen federal agents. Marcus Hale, Reyes announced, you are under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The room exploded into pandemonium. Cameras flashed like lightning. Guests scrambled for the exits. And Marcus stood frozen, his perfect facade finally cracking. This is impossible, he sputtered. I have protection. But Senator Cole is being arrested as we speak, Elena said. Your judges are being investigated. Your empire is finished. She stepped closer until they were face to face. You left me bleeding in the street, she whispered. You took my daughter. You tried to destroy everything I love. Her eyes blazed. But I am still standing, and you are going to spend the rest of your life in prison. Marcus's face contorted with rage. He lunged for her, hands reaching for her throat. But the FBI agents were faster. They tackled him to the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back as he screamed obscenities. Elena watched as they dragged him away. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a bone-deep exhaustion and a desperate longing for the only thing that truly mattered. "Where's my daughter?" she asked Reyes. "In Brooklyn," he said. "Your father has her. She is safe." Elena closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to breathe. It was over. The drive to Brooklyn felt longer than any journey Elena had ever taken. She sat in the back of an FBI SUV, watching the city lights blur past, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. What if Grace did not remember her? What if 6 weeks of separation had been too long? What if she had lost her daughter forever? Charlie sat beside her, holding her hand. "She is going to know you," Charlie said softly. "Babies know their mothers. What if she does not? Then you will teach her. You have the rest of your lives." The SUV pulled up in front of her father's house in Bay Ridge, the same house where Elena had grown up, the same house where she had learned about love and family and strength. She walked up the familiar front steps. Her father opened the door before she could knock. "Mija," he said, his eyes bright with tears. "She is waiting for you." Elena walked into the living room, and there she was. Grace was sitting in her grandfather's old armchair, wrapped in a pink blanket, watching the door with wide, curious eyes. When she saw Elena, her face broke into a smile. "Mama," she babbled, reaching out with tiny hands. Elena fell to her knees. She gathered her daughter into her arms and held her close, breathing in the scent of baby powder and innocence. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy. "I am here," she whispered. "I am here, and I am never letting go." Grace grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair and gurgled happily, as if to say, "I know." The two of them. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media attention. Marcus's trial dominated the news. Evidence that Elena and Diane had gathered was presented in devastating detail. Former employees testified about the fraud. Forensic accountants explained the Ponzi scheme. And Elena herself took the stand, recounting everything Marcus had done with calm, unshakable clarity. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all counts. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Senator Cole received 15. The network of corrupt officials that had protected Marcus for decades was dismantled, piece by piece. Diane Hale liquidated the family fortune and donated most of it to charities supporting domestic violence survivors. She also established a trust fund for Grace, ensuring that the child would never want for anything. "I cannot undo the damage my son caused," Diane told Elena at their final meeting, "but I can try to make amends." "Starting with your daughter?" Elena nodded. "Thank you for everything." Diane smiled sadly. "Thank you for having the courage I never did." Gabriel did not live to see the final verdict. The cancer that had been slowly killing him claimed his life 2 weeks before the trial ended, but Elena was there at the end, holding his hand, promising him that justice would be served. "I am proud of you," he whispered with his last breath. "Your mother would be proud too." Elena wept at his funeral. She wept for the man who had been like a father to her. She wept for the mentor who had helped her become the woman she was. But she also smiled, because Gabriel had died knowing that his life's work was complete, that the criminals he had spent decades pursuing were finally facing justice. It was the ending he would have wanted. 1 year later, Elena stood on the rooftop of her new apartment building, watching the sun set over Manhattan. So much had changed. The penthouse where she had once lived as Marcus's wife had been sold, the proceeds donated to charity. The rehabilitation facility, where she had learned to walk again, had become a distant memory. The woman who had been broken and desperate was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, more certain of her own worth. Grace was walking now, toddling around the apartment with the fearless confidence of a child who knew she was loved. Elena watched her daughter every day with wonder and gratitude, marveling at this tiny person who had given her the strength to keep fighting. She had written a book about her experience, a memoir that had become a bestseller, inspiring thousands of women who had survived similar abuse. She had founded a nonprofit called Grace's Foundation, providing legal and financial support to victims of domestic violence. And she had finally found peace. The door to the roof opened, and Charlie appeared with 2 glasses of wine. "Thought you could use some company," Charlie said, handing her a glass. Elena smiled. "Always." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker to life below. "So," Charlie said finally, "what now?" "What do you mean?" "You have beaten the bad guy, saved your daughter, written the book, started the charity." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "What is next for Elena Cross, legendary Avenger?" Elena laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind she had not been capable of for years. "Now I live," she said simply. "I raise my daughter. I help other women who were where I was. I enjoy every day I have been given." "That is very zen of you." "I writ it on a coffee mug." They both laughed, and for a moment, everything felt light and simple and good. But Elena had one more piece of business to attend to. 6 months later, she walked into the federal prison where Marcus Hale was serving his sentence. She wore a simple black dress and carried a folder in her hand. Her expression was calm, almost serene. Marcus was waiting in the visiting room, his orange jumpsuit a far cry from the designer suits he once wore. He had aged a decade in the past year. The arrogance was still there, but it was brittle now. A shell over something hollow and defeated. "Elena," he said as she sat across from him, "I did not expect to see you here. I have something for you." She slid the folder across the table. Marcus opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. "What is this?" "A receipt," Elena said, "for the $50 million you thought was hidden in the Caymans." Marcus's face went pale. "How did you—" "I found it 6 months ago. I emptied the account yesterday." Elena smiled. "Every penny has been donated to survivors of domestic abuse. In your name." For a moment, Marcus was speechless. Then rage contorted his features. "You have no right," he snarled. "That money was mine. Actually, it was ours. Community property. And since you tried to have me killed, I thought it only fair that I decide how to spend it." She stood and walked to the door. Then she paused and looked back. "Have a nice life, Marcus." He lunged across the table, screaming obscenities. Guards rushed in to restrain him, and Elena walked out into the sunlight, finally free. She found Charlie waiting in the parking lot, with Grace in her car seat. "How did it go?" Charlie asked. "Better than expected." Elena slid into the passenger seat and looked at her daughter. Grace was sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "Where to now?" Charlie asked. Elena thought for a moment. Then she smiled. "Home," she said. "Take us home." As they drove through the city, Elena watched the buildings passing by. The same city where she had fallen in love, been betrayed, been broken, and finally risen again. It had been a long journey, longer than she ever could have imagined when she was a young forensic accountant, with dreams of making a difference. But she had made a difference. She had survived. She had won. And now, with her daughter beside her and her best friend behind the wheel, Elena Cross was finally ready to live the life she had fought so hard to protect. The best revenge, she realized, was not destruction. It was not vengeance. It was not watching your enemy fall. The best revenge was happiness. It was love. It was holding your daughter close and knowing that no one could ever take her away again. Elena had learned many lessons in the past 3 years about trust, about betrayal, about the darkness that lurks in the hearts of men. But the most important lesson was this: no matter how deep the darkness, there is always a way back to the light. No matter how broken you feel, there is always a path to healing. No matter how hopeless things seem, there is always a reason to keep fighting. Because fate does not forget cruelty, and in the end, justice always finds a way. If you have ever been betrayed, if you have ever felt powerless, if you have ever wondered whether justice truly exists, then stay with me until the end. And if this story moves you, share it with someone who needs to hear that survivors can become warriors. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Closing message. And that, my friends, is the story of Elena Cross, a woman who was thrown away like trash and rose to become the storm that destroyed an empire. Remember this: the people who try to break you have no idea what they are creating. They think they are ending your story, but sometimes they are just writing your origin. Final call to action. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button. If you know someone fighting their own battle right now, share this with them. And if you want more stories of justice, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Because together, we are not just watching stories. We are reminding each other that no matter what life throws at us, we can rise. Content credit. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories and valuable life lessons to our audience. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.